So in the previous video we looked at ways in which we can integrate control and connection in our lives, our capacities to both get and have stuff, to improve things for the better, and our capacities for being open to what we don't know, for gaining a deeper understanding and insight into what matters. But I want to do something a bit different in this video, which is think, where are we coming from in trying to achieve that balance? So I mentioned in the very first video that we live in a predominantly control-based society. We want to improve everything. We want to solve all our problems. We want to be happy. And in trying to find a balance between our capacities for control and our capacities for connection, we can still be slightly weighted one way or the other. We can always ask the question, well, why are we trying to achieve that balance? What ultimately matters to us? And we can answer that question either from a control perspective, well, the things that ultimately matter are the things we can get and have to make our lives good. Or we can ultimately answer that question from a connection perspective. Well, what matters is having a deeper understanding of what matters, to be in ongoing relationship with that understanding, to being responsible and flexible and continuously open and curious. And I want to ask you how you would feel looking back at the end of your life. Now, suppose, for example, you had a good life. And how would you ultimately describe that? So let's say you achieved various of the things that you wanted to achieve. Would you look back at your life and say, well, ultimately what was so good about my life is that I had a great relationship, that I had a great career, that I was healthy most of the time, and so on. These outcomes, this picture of what your life looked like. Or would you answer by saying, yes, I had a great life, I continued to be open to what matters, to respond to the best of my ability. Now, you may have got many of the things that you wanted, you may have had many of the things that we just mentioned, but what ultimately mattered is that process of life, not just the outcomes, not just what your life looked like, but the process of how you went about living your life, how you approached getting those things rather than simply getting them. So this is these two kind of fundamentally different ways in which we can look at reality, in which we can look at ourselves, our relationships, our work, and our lives as a whole. What ultimately matters? From a control perspective, it's outcomes. It's what our life looks like. It's kind of plan A. It's the life plan we create for ourselves. Okay, I would like a life that looked like this, having this and getting that, and so on. But from a connection perspective, it's not outcomes, it's the process of living life. It's being open to what matters. It's responding to whatever insights we have. It's doing the best we can with our resources and information. It's doing the best we can by the people we love, whether we achieve our goals and ambitions or not. It's how we approach life rather than what our life looks like. It's often plan B. It's often not, the fact that life just went to plan, but when things change, when maybe we faced various crises or tragedies, how we were able to adapt to that. It's the kind of story we often have looking back at our lives rather than how we feel while we're living it. So this different way of looking at our lives, looking at the process of our lives rather than the outcomes, looking at how we live our lives, the quality of our lives rather than what our lives looks like, rather than the quantity of things we have or have got, and looking primarily at plan B, what happens when things go wrong, why we need to develop this openness to what matters, why we need things like curiosity, compassion, forgiveness, as essentially as the things that we then get with those capacities. So that's the question I want to ask you listening to this video. And what I ultimately believe is that there isn't really a right and wrong answer. There is no thing of ultimate importance. Both are very important, the outcomes of our lives and the process of our lives, the things we can control and the ways in which we can be in connection with what matters. But they have very different impacts on how our lives go, and indeed they have very different impacts on society and our more collective lives. So we're going to look at that in the next video, and we're going to explore how, again, through living predominantly control-based lives, they end up looking a certain way, because we're answering this: what is ultimately important in our relationships, what is ultimately important in our work, in our lives as a whole, from this control perspective rather than from the perspective of connection.